Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Cloud Security Strategies, Bridging the Gap Between Development and Detection webinar. I'll turn it over here to Thomas Gardner to give an introduction, and then I'll introduce myself.
Perfect, yeah. So I'm Thomas. I am a senior detection engineer here at Red Canary. I've been here about 4 years, and my job is focused all around how do you detect attacker behavior, how do you communicate it to other security teams, and a lot of it ends up being working with cloud architects like Brian, our engineers internally, to just sort of also understand the development aspect of sort of normal business practices so that we don't end up just shooting false positives out to our customers all the time.
Well, excellent. And I'm Brian Davis. I'm a principal software engineer here at Red Canary. And the title that I often go by is Cloud Architect. I end up going with a lot of different titles, but my job frequently is to work kind of across the engineering team to help them in building something that's going to scale, right? As we add more capability, as we add more detections, as we add more customers, our system grows, and we need to make sure that we can continue to scale it. And leveraging the cloud resources to do that is one of the areas that I work with our engineering teams on, right? They're focused on solving the particular problem. My job is to kind of take a longer view and say, well, if they implement this particular solution, is this going to cause us a problem in 6 months, or can we continue to grow and add things over time? And so that's kind of the role that I tend to fill here and at other places in my career. So if you're joining us today, this is somewhat of an extension from a podcast that Thomas and I did a couple weeks back on the CyberWire-X podcast, where we were kind of talking through this particular thing about the fact that developers, principal software engineers, cloud architects, and detection engineers or security practitioners can sometimes be at odds with one another because we frequently have different objectives. And so that podcast explored kind of the relationship that we have between them. And the whole idea today was to kind of dive into that a little bit more. And I think that the goal is really to give the audience a chance to ask questions of us, because we can talk through things as much as we want, and we can entertain ourselves talking about Raspberry Pis and Perl scripts as we have before. But I think this is more interesting if you all have questions to ask of us as we move forward here. And it does look like there's a comment. So I'll turn up the mic a little bit more for Thomas. So hopefully you guys can hear us a little bit better. Let us know if that you can't. So with that, I'll ask Thomas the question of, from a background standpoint, what is the background of a detection engineer? How did you get into this role, and how did you build the expertise that you have in this?
Yeah, so I always like answering this question because there are some standard backgrounds for detection engineering. A lot of us come from like incident response, threat intelligence, a lot of digital forensics, but we've actually had a really diverse set of people like working for us. We have a guy who did auto mechanics for many years. We've had I think several school teachers, like former school teachers, who work for us, and they all just sort of started taking like courses in cybersecurity, learning online, and sort of just worked their way up from either like help desk roles, system administration roles, or some people just sort of have enough of a personal interest that their sort of past work experience didn't quite matter so much. But there's a lot of avenues into detection engineering, into really any sort of security operations role. And in my experience, the best security operations teams tend to have a really diverse set of backgrounds, so that we kind of all have to come in together and work creatively to solve sort of security problems. My own background was in incident response. I worked at a global telecom for many years, that and sort of threat intel sort of side of things. And those tend to be really heavily popular backgrounds for detection engineering, because you come in with a certain prerequisite set of like knowledge about like attack chains, like how attackers think, how they work. You come in with an understanding of a lot of the tooling that we use. Like Red Canary, we're really heavily known for our like EDR expertise. Our like threat detection reports cover a lot of endpoint detection ideas. We've been the last few years pivoting a lot more into identity detection, a lot of cloud detection, and incident response often gives you that sort of background skill set as well, because you have to dig into CloudTrail, or you have to dig into Office 365 logs, or you have to use one or several EDRs, depending on the company you're in, to investigate threats happening in your company and sort of forensically analyze during and after an incident kind of what happened. So that's, yeah, those are kind of the big background hits.
No, I think that's fantastic. I'll go ahead and answer the same question from a cloud architecture standpoint. How did I get into this? And I think the answer for me was that I kind of was raised as a software engineer. I was writing code, I was developing things, and I always wanted to see more of the big picture. That's just my own personality. And so more and more of the opportunities I got when I was down in the code was to pull back and see how did these things work in the bigger picture. And so that put me more into an overall software architecture type of role in my previous jobs before the cloud was really the thing that we were leaning on. And then as the cloud came along, I really embraced it because I saw how much it solved a lot of the technical problems that we had, that we could address, that we didn't have to deal with when we're dealing with on-prem hardware and things of that nature. And so more and more I learned about the cloud. And so it was kind of my background of software architecture combined with knowledge of the cloud that kind of leaned me into there. It looks like we actually have a couple of folks that have asked some questions here in the Q&A box. I'll kind of go through. Adam, I'll give you that first one because it looks like talking about UCPE equipment, and I have to admit that as a software engineering person, I'm not familiar with that. Can you talk to that?
Well, use case?
Oh no! So the very first question: do you think UCPE equipment is the future of top-down security from the hardware to the application layer?
I'm not familiar with the acronym.
So let's go ahead and skip that one. So coming down then, so if you're new to cloud, how would you think about building detections for cloud platforms? Focus on using native logs or being tools dependent? I'll let Thomas tackle that one.
Yeah. Great spot to start in my mind is always sort of the threat intelligence aspect of what threats are actually out there. Like when you're reading about like cloud compromises, typically there are a certain set of behaviors that like reports, when we write up reports, we'll try and explicitly point those out. I know other companies similar to us and other like threat intel companies will explicitly point out specific behaviors that attackers do over the course of an incident. Collecting those behaviors first is a great start. When you're getting familiar with the cloud, not only does it give you an understanding of like what an attacker is trying to do, how they're going about doing it, it also, in my mind, helps a lot with terminology. Things like compromising like certain, like in Amazon S3 buckets, like a lot of people shorten that to S3. A lot of threat intel reports will sort of give you it when an attacker like targets those kinds of things. They'll give you sort of an overview of S3 at first, maybe a sentence, maybe a small phrase that you can then Google more about. And then the following references will sort of be the more shortened, more informal acronym. And I found that sort of getting familiar with just the terminology by reading threat intel reports and applying them to like attacker behavior was the best way for me personally to get familiar enough with the cloud to start building detectors, because they provide both the detector ideas as well as the terminology that actually inform me about how they fit into an attacker like sort of life cycle, and the terminology to then Google or search for additional information to look for.
Oh, fantastic. Looks like there's another question that came in. With IAM growing as a major attack vector, how can an organization safeguard their environment and their cloud environment when there is a need for third-party involvement?
This one might be a good joint one. From a like detection side, I am absolutely as a major attack vector. One of the big things that a lot of like cloud platforms are doing, a lot of just like more sophisticated services like identity services like Okta and Entra are doing is providing things like conditional access policies that you can go and sort of proactively get ahead based on security policies you already have, you can sort of lock down where people can log in from, time, like what time of day they can log in from and stuff, and get very sophisticated in terms of like, are they coming from like compliant devices? Have they checked in a while? Have they generated previous security alerts recently too? There's really a lot of good sophisticated stuff when you're working with these more sophisticated like identity services from a detection standpoint. Trying to take that telemetry from the identity services can be a challenge sometimes, but I know a lot of them are really doing a much better job now than they did, say, 5-10 years ago, when identity detection was really first getting like its feet wet. They're really doing a lot better job of providing like good audit logging. Really doing, the services themselves are doing a really good job of actually providing incident reports, like a lot of the Okta reports we heard last year about the different like breaches, and Okta provided really great write-ups on like how attackers actually breached like the Okta environments or Okta services themselves. So yeah, really leaning into the sort of preventative controls, including like those complex sort of conditions, and making good use, getting familiar with the sort of audit logging that's available to you is a really good spot from a detection standpoint, from an architecture. Though.
Well, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because everything that you talked about are good ways to tackle the threat. But one of the challenges that you have with IAM with anything is that you probably have more static credentials out in your environment than you necessarily want. And it's because of people like me, unfortunately, because when you're building software, you can build it right, you can build it fast. Sometimes you can't do both at the same time. And so you end up with an application that's been developed that has a whole bunch of static credentials scattered about. And then you'll have your security team coming in, rightfully so, and saying, hey, it's time to get rid of those static credentials. It's time to use, dynamically elevated permissions when you need to. It's time to use role-based access instead of static keys. But the problem is some of those static credentials they're load bearing. They're baked into your infrastructure. They're baked into all the places that you don't necessarily want them to be, perhaps with more privileges than you necessarily want them. And so that's always the balance of having those detectors be able to fire when stuff happens that you're not supposed to necessarily have, but knowing what's an acceptable behavior because of the way that the infrastructure was built over time. And that's a really serious challenge that I think that from a development standpoint, we've always had. And when we talk to our security team and say, we need to get rid of these static keys here, or the way you're accessing those resources here. And even as an engineer, when you build something, you say, I know the idea of least principles or least privileges. I should neck this down to be this small. That's going to take me 4 more hours of development that I don't necessarily have time for. I'll just reuse this role that I have over here because it's already in existence. I'll just put it over here.
Yeah.
And those are the things that make detecting those threats significantly harder. And it's one of those hard trade-offs. And cloud gives you so much flexibility and enough rope to hang yourself, unfortunately.
Yeah, understanding sort of that initial who got compromised first is often a very difficult part of an incident. Often one of the most and least fun at the same time, I'm curious, going off of that, do you have any advice for anybody currently going through like a lift and shift to the cloud from like an on-prem where maybe they had a lot of static credentials to like how they can start using more sophisticated IAM policies in the cloud?
Ooh, that's a really, really hard question. Already, if you're doing a lift and shift into the cloud, you're going through a lot of serious pain and struggle to begin with. I think the best advice I would have is to take someone that understands how the IAM credentials work for that cloud platform, and it differs a little bit by cloud provider, and have them work with the engineering team to come up with a plan. Because when you're moving stuff and when you're already going through and changing credentials around, that's probably the best time to be also changing those to be more dynamic credentials, role-based, whatever the case might be. Simply because otherwise you'll never get around to doing it again. And if you have someone that understands how that works, that can go through that painstaking process of saying, okay, well, these are the static keys that we should replace. These are the permission sets we should reduce. These are the accesses that we should go and revoke. That's a good strategy to then mix in. The challenge is if you're lifting and shifting, you already have a lot of work on your plate. Adding more is not necessarily palatable. But again, it comes back to if you don't do it now, you may never do it. And that's just setting yourself up for a compromise in the future that you don't want to be a part of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, excellent. Do you want to see if we have some more questions? I think a couple more came in, but they've scrolled up past on my screen. There we go. It looks like there was a question about use case libraries somewhere we can reference. I'm not sure what the asker is referring to from use case library.
So I believe, feel free to throw it in the chat if I'm incorrect, but something like detection use cases is what that's referring to. So the sort of, I don't know if time test is the right word. Time tested may be the correct phrase here, but the really popular one that sort of everybody getting started in detection goes to is the Sigma library on GitHub. And I absolutely throw my weight behind that too, for whatever that is. So Sigma as a detection engine is really, really cool. It's very flexible. It's very easy to read. Just a bunch of YAML files. And they have so many people contributing to it across not just like cloud and identity and whatnot, but sort of all sorts of common popular detection domains. If you're looking to get started in detection itself, Sigma's the right way to go. There are also so many awesome security lists on GitHub as well that provide additional links outside to different projects or different like cool repositories also in GitHub. And that's probably the go-to that I would start with. Outside of that, I believe it's Panther Labs has also a bunch of open source rules. They are a pretty cool company as well. And I know I've looked at some of their CloudTrail rules before. Really like that they also bundle like notes in with them, and they're like they use a lot of Python, but their logic is pretty easy to read if you're familiar with Python for sure. Also probably another really good resource to provide, as well as our own threat detection report, which has a few cloud ideas in it. But that's probably where I'd start from a use case library for detection standpoint.
Excellent. I was thinking as we were talking through this, one of the topics for today's fireside chat, and we were sad that we don't actually have a fireside. We were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, we really wanted to go out to the Colorado mountains with
a campfire.
Yeah, with a campfire, but couldn't make it work.
If bridging the gap between our two roles is so important, what are the types of things that someone in a cloud architect role can do that makes the job of a detection engineer really challenging? I mean, we've talked about this a little bit before, but what are the things that you've seen before that raise your eyebrows that then cause potentially an awkward conversation?
No awkward conversations, very open conversations. So I personally really love like Kubernetes detection, like from that standpoint. But there are so many things that you hear about as like a security person working incident response, threat intel, again, detection engineering, that sort of raise your eyebrows in sort of any new Kubernetes environment that you're introduced to, where you hear things like, all right, nobody should ever interactively log into a pod, right? Nobody should ever like create like an elevated like role. And there are definitely some things that are instant no-nos, like anonymous access to the Kubernetes API, especially from the internet. But there have been several times where we've seen, say, a new Kubernetes cluster being deployed and exactly one of those scenarios, like interactive like pod logins. We've seen, privilege role bindings created, stuff like that. And it's taken a bit of effort to understand why those were actually legitimate actions. I think I used this during the podcast, but I had this repeated to me the other day too. It's totally understandable why an engineer during an incident would log into a Kubernetes cluster, right? Sometimes things just need to be investigated in person, whatever the equivalent of person is for shell logins.
As close as you can for Kubernetes.
Yeah, exactly. It's totally reasonable. And I don't want to sort of get in the way of an incident investigation just because I think that's not the right way to do it, because I'm also not in the middle of that incident, right? I'm not under that sort of pressure to maybe get things going again, maybe under that sort of pressure to understand the system at that deep of a level. What I am trying to do though is understand are there, as a detection engineer, I'm just trying to understand how can I detect threats who do that versus regular engineers who do that. But as a security person, maybe as again, former incident responder or something like that, maybe I'm also trying to understand how can I enable you to investigate these incidents? How can I enable you to work these without logging in interactively? That's sort of the personal challenge I've faced a lot of times. And it doesn't really result in awkward conversations a lot, because I think just like detection engineers, regular software engineers want to talk about the job all the time. We love talking about it. And so just asking questions with some sort of empathy, I think, tends to lower the awkwardness level.
Yeah, I would actually echo that. I think that's one of the things that I've encountered a lot in my career is that there are certain things that you do either because it's part of your day job or it's part of an emergency, incident response of a technical nature, where you might be doing something that looks very, very suspicious, but it's a totally sanctioned and okay activity. And so it comes down to having that conversation, and it comes down to having those lines of communication open. Another perfect example, someone from our security team pinged me on Slack the other day and said, hey, we see that there's some S3 bucket access from an unknown IP address. What's that all about? And I was just as flummoxed as he was. And it turns out that my laptop pinged off of a random Wi-Fi that I had on my phone. And it said, oh, okay, well, that's an IP address that apparently some public Wi-Fi had. And I was going over, a secure connection in order to get there. But it was enough to fire off a detector somewhere. And so it comes back to that. All right, is this something that we need to mitigate from a security standpoint? Is there a process we need to change? Or is there a risk that needs to be mitigated? Or is this just, nope, that's an okay. This is a false positive that we need to protect against somehow in the future. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge. But I think communication between the two teams is really, really critical. So we're coming up about on time here. There was one question that was asked in chat that I'll at least read out here was, I was wondering with dealing with third-party cloud providers, how you can be sure your data is secure when there's reports of the cloud providers getting compromised. So that's a really interesting question, and I can't speak for cloud providers because I'm not a cloud provider. I work for Red Canary. That's why I have a canary on my shirt. But the perspective that I always take on this is it's in cloud providers' best interest not to get breached. It's very important for them to not have that happen. And so I rest assured knowing that while Red Canary is out there, we're protecting our customers, the cloud providers are out there doing everything that they can to protect against those data breaches happening, even, except for misconfiguration on the part of the users, which is something that cloud providers are making it harder and harder for you to do. As an example, I think you can't create an S3 bucket now with open public permissions unless you click 15 checkboxes saying, yes, I understand, I know what this is.
That's actually my favorite pastime.
What, to open public S3 buckets?
Just create new ones. That's
why not? So it's in their best interest to protect that. And I kind of look at it from their financial motivation is to make sure that they are protecting your data, and they're doing what they can to make sure that that's there. So that's my take on the matter. I don't know if, Thomas, you have any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I really wouldn't add too much to that. I think it's very accurate. As far as trying to feel secure when that security is in some ways out of your hands, there are some things you can do, especially it depends a lot on how you work with the cloud provider. An S3 bucket, for example, if you're uploading stuff to it, you can also encrypt it on your side before you upload it to them. If you're worried about misconfiguration, for example, like if you're worried about opening it up to the internet, even if it's open to the internet, unless the attacker has keys to your encrypted objects, then they can't really do much with it, even if they take it. But that's a very hard thing to address for sure, because I think to the question's point, in some ways it's just out of your hands. And trying to ensure you're going with like a cloud provider who is well known for responding to breaches, someone who is very open about sort of when things go wrong, like how things go wrong, and is able to sort of give you that peace of mind just in terms of, all right, if they're not sharing things with me now, it doesn't mean that something happened and they're hiding it. It means that there's just nothing going on. And that maybe it's more of a peace of mind thing there, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Well, excellent. I think we're at time for today's webinar. I think if this was good, maybe we'll do this again next time by a real fire. So I think I'll provide some feedback whether or not this was valuable. Thank you all for attending. Thanks for asking some great questions. I think this is some fantastic stuff, and I will look forward to chatting with you guys sometime in the near future.
Thank you.